What past Philadelphia Eagles team most resembles this year's version of the Birds? All that and more coming your way on this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcome in, Eagles fans, to this Thursday edition of the show. I'm your host, Louis DiBiase. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sports, they stop sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everybody every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's edition of the show, we're going to get into past Eagles teams that I think most resemble this 2024 squad. Plus, Nick Sirianni talked about his training camp practice strategy last week in a press conference with the media. Is he going to change things up compared to the past few years? Is it going to be heavier, more consistent practices? Will it remain the lighter schedule? All that and more, kicked out of the nest, also coming your way. And I was thinking about this yesterday, just, again, looking through Eagles history, seeing, the track record of eras, like the trajectory. Is there any sort of trends that we can pick on and kind of pinpoint to say, yes, I feel like this is where this team is going this year based on the history? And I even mentioned something about this a few days ago, how normally when the Eagles head into a season as like perennial Super Bowl contenders, trying to follow up a big run, normally those are the years they disappoint, right? 2011, 2015 and 14, you could say, both years after Chip Kelly's first season, 2018 and 2019 after the Super Bowl win. Now we know 2023, of course, fits into that equation. But the years that they're kind of counted out or they take that step back and they have to build back up, those are normally the seasons they have big years, like 2017, like 2022, kind of 2024. Not that they're not a favorite this year, but they're not a top 3 contender consensusly. I don't know if that's even a word, but you know what I mean? The majority of the league, like analysts, fans, teams themselves, are the Eagles a top 3 team in the NFL right now, a top 4 team? I think they're top 5, top 6. I don't know if many have them top 3 right now, and that's normally the seasons when they do overachieve. What specific team, though, does this 2024 Eagles roster most remind me of, based on the timeline of this era, based on the roster, the way it looks, based on just the landscape of the league this year? And I don't be alarmed, because I think some people are going to be like, ooh, that's kind of disappointing that that's who they remind you of. I think this version of the Eagles gives me, and I'm not saying the end of the season result will be the same as these two teams, who both lost in the wild card round, but I do think the 2024 Eagles, for many reasons, they do remind me of the 2010 team and the 2019 team, and I'll tell you why, and those are two of my favorite Eagles teams of all time. So I take this as a positive. You probably don't, because if the Eagles lose in the first round, that's a failure of a season, which I completely agree with. But why they remind me of those two teams is, and again, it's not because I think they're going to choke in the first round. I think, number one, this team on paper has an elite offense. On paper, you're saying this is one of, if not the most talented offensive groups in franchise history. And the only other times that you can say that, really, outside of this current era, so you could say that the past 2 years, but in past eras, you could say that about the 2010 team with Michael Vick, LaShawn McCoy, Deshaun Jackson, Jeremy Maclin, Jason Avant, Brent Selleck, an elite offensive line, an elite play caller with Andy Reid. That team had everything that this 2024 offense has. On paper, again, 2010, on the field, the result was the same as that potential on paper. 2019, of course, we know they did not nearly meet the expectations we had that offseason. But remember, on paper, that 2019 offense, I said at the time, was the most talented on paper that this Eagles team maybe has ever had. They had Carson Wentz, they had Deshaun Jackson, Alshon Jeffrey, Nelson Aguilar, Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert. J.J. Arcega-Whiteside at the time was a rookie second-round receiver talent, so we thought he was going to be good. Miles Sanders was a second-round rookie running back. They had Jordan Howard. They had Darren Sproles. They had Corey Clement. They had an elite offensive line still. They had Doug Peterson as a play caller. So to me, like, this team resembles those two teams in that way a lot. You also had multi-dimensional quarterbacks, Michael Vick, Carson Wentz, Jalen Hurts. And it's kind of a transition year on defense, right? 2010 was only year 2 of Sean McDermott as the defensive coordinator, taking over for the late, great Jim Johnson. You look at 2019, they were not going completely younger, but it was a different looking defense than 2017 and even 2018. I think they were hoping that a younger secondary was going to take over. Guys like Rasul Douglas, Sidney Jones, Avonte Maddox, and Cravon LeBlanc were coming off really impressive playoff runs of 2018. They had a new-looking linebacker core. You look at it like no more Jordan Hicks, no more Michael Kendricks. It was really just Nigel Bradham and a bunch of young guys. And then the defensive line, too, like they were transitioning as well, more towards hoping Josh Sweat and Derek Barnett were going to take over as opposed to Brandon Graham and Vinnie Curry. Vinnie Curry came back, but he was a backup. They were hoping Sweat and Barnett were going to be the leaders of that group because Brandon Graham was re-signed. Remember, they thought he'd be gone in 2018. He came back in 2019 and had a really good year, but in 2018, remember, he only had 4 sacks, and they did think that he was probably gone the next year. So they were ready to turn it over to Derek Barnett and Josh Sweat. This year, it's kind of the same thing. This year's team has a lot more turnover on defense, a changing of the guard, if you will. It's a lot younger on all 3 levels. Like they are relying solely on youth, where that 2019 team was still trying to maximize that Super Bowl window. They were still relying on a lot of veterans like Graham, like Fletcher Cox, like Malik Jackson, and I believe Timmy Jernigan was still on that team, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe 2018 was his last year. I can't remember precisely, but it was the year right before Javon Hargrave came in. So overall, that team, though, was kind of in a transition on defense. And yes, did they disappoint at the end of the year? Absolutely. I'm not saying the Eagles are going to, this 2024 team is going to suffer the same fate as those two teams, but they do resemble them a lot when it comes to their potential, the way their roster is structured. They have new coordinators as well. So it's kind of like a make or break season for Nick Sirianni. And 2019, I don't want to say it was a make or break year because that was really 2020, but 2019 was kind of the last hurrah for that window right before Howie went. Really, 2020 even, he took some drastic steps to change that roster. It got a lot younger than it was in 2019, especially like you look at the receiving core, for instance. And then we know, of course, at the end, they lost in the wild card. But I will say that 2019 team, if they don't lose Deshaun Jackson, if they don't lose Alshon Jeffrey, if they don't lose Nelson Aguilar and pretty much everybody in that receiving core, Carson Wentz was the hottest quarterback in all of December and January heading into the postseason. If they had those guys, who's to say that that team couldn't have been better than a one-and-done playoff squad? Like if Carson Wentz doesn't get hurt in that Seattle game and they win the wild card round, which in my opinion they would have if Wentz played, you look at the next round. If Djax is back, by the way, Lane Johnson was out. If Alshon Jeffrey comes back, you don't think they can beat Green Bay on the road? They did that already in that regular season. So they had already beaten Green Bay on the road. That could have been a team that got to the second round, maybe even the NFC Championship. Like the 2019 team, I think was a lot better. I hold them in higher regard than most. I think it was just a product, again, of just some catastrophic injuries and some bad roster moves. And the 2010 team, they were one and done, but they're a shoelace tackle on Deshaun Jackson and an underthrown Michael Vick ball away from potentially going to the Super Bowl. Like if they beat the Green Bay Packers, if they make those 2 plays with 2 minutes to go in the fourth quarter and they hold on to win that game, they're going to Chicago, right? And I think they beat the Bears with Jay Cutler, who would have got hurt, and it was, Caleb Haney? Then they go to they would have went to Seattle. They would have hosted Seattle in the second round, and they would have crushed that bad Seahawks team, in my opinion. And then they would have probably played the Bears in the NFC Championship or the Falcons, and I think they win those games. So those teams, I'm not saying it's a bad thing that the Eagles this year remind me of the 2019 Birds or the 2010 Eagles. I think it could be a good thing. Those teams did not meet expectations, but I don't think those were complete train wreck, disappointing teams in franchise history. Considering circumstance, there was just things that just didn't go right for them at the end of the year. But I don't think they were so far off where neither one of those teams could have made it to the Final Four or heck, even a Super Bowl. So I think, yeah, and again, they could be the 2022 Eagles. They are that talented. They could make a Super Bowl. But I think that outside of that team, like if I had to compare them to a non-Super Bowl Eagles roster, I would say it's, I don't know, for me, 2010, 2019, you could even say 2013, like the first year of Chip Kelly. I think those teams would make some sense. And again, it just kind of feels like this isn't like the last hoorah for this core, but it's a very important year. And I think 2010 was that for Andy Reid and for a lot of those veterans, and I think 2019 was that as well for Doug Peterson and Carson Wentz, and we know now they only got one more year after that. So I'm not saying Howie and Lurie are going to blow it up this year if they're a wild card or division and out kind of team, but there's a lot of pressure on this football team just like there was those past teams, and there's a lot of offseason expectations just like there was back then. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, practice strategies. We're going to talk about training camp for the Birds. Nick Sirianni, what approach should he take this year versus past seasons? Will Vic Fangio influence that at all? Kellen Moore, we'll get into that coming your way right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast, we're brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just a job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role in a given month. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. Once again, that's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. Hey guys, thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. By the way, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Got to turn down the volume with all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Training camp starts next week for the Philadelphia Eagles. Normally, Nick Sirianni is a guy that has lighter practices, a lot of walkthroughs, a lot of shells, not a lot of live tackling. Like the pads don't go on a whole lot. They like to keep it light. They like to have starters get a lot of rest days, especially older veterans. You know, when Jason Kelce was playing and Fletcher Cox, you'll see a lot of maintenance days for, I would say Brandon Graham and Lane Johnson and a lot of those stars. Heck, maybe even like a Jordan Mailata or Landon Dickerson, Saquon Barkley. Like, keep those guys fresh for the regular season. A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, a lot of those key players that are older or in their prime that you really need this year. That has normally been Nick Sirianni's approach. He's barely played starters, and each year he plays them fewer and fewer, to the point where last year most of your core barely played a snap in the preseason. Like Jalen Hurts didn't touch the field. And I agree with that strategy. I think the rest of the NFL has adopted that as well. Being healthy is so important, especially getting out of the gate. It's so hard when you start the year 1-3, 2-4, 2-5. We know that with the 2021 Eagles. Like, yes, they were able to overcome that and make the playoffs. But normally, if an NFL team starts off really slow, it's hard to overcome that. And if you deal with injuries, like that's the number one way to derail a season. And the Eagles have been relatively healthy in the Nick Sirianni era, but we saw how I talked about the 2019 Eagles, the 2018 Eagles, 2017, 2020, the whole Doug Peterson era. They were always banged up, and it really always held back their potential. We never were able to see that 2019 roster in full form. 2018 as well. Heck, even to a certain degree, 2020, although it wasn't that talented of a roster. So I agree with the strategy of staying light, resting players a lot, like just getting to the regular season. And I know some people are concerned about rust in that way, but history tells us that, at least in the Sirianni era, they don't come out sluggish. Like outside of 2021, the last 2 years, the Eagles started off red hot, where they lost in the first 2 months of 2022, the first 2 months of 2023, they lost one game. So I don't think, and Sirianni mentioned that as well in his press conference last week, because they asked him, the media asked him, is he going to change things up in practice because of the collapse last year? Like, does this team need to be pushed harder? Do they need to practice harder? Do they need to tackle to the ground and totally change their philosophy? And Nick said, to a degree, they want to rev things up a little bit, but overall, the problem last year wasn't that the Eagles were sluggish out of the gate. It wasn't really that even... And injuries hit. Injuries was a huge reason the Eagles were held back last year. So that's honestly the collapse last year to me is proof that you need to stay on track with what you're doing in the summer. Like, in my opinion, I think injuries were, look at the secondary. Look at the slot position specifically. You got to keep these guys healthy. Like, that is so important. And I do wonder, because Vic Fangio made some comments in his first press conference about he said he's going to want to talk to Nick Sirianni about getting more practices in. He's an old school coach. I'm sure he loves live hitting. He probably wants it every single day. And I'm sure Fangio will have some sort of influence in Sirianni's ear. I think he will be talking to him, and I think they might rev it up a little bit more than in the past. But I really hope Sirianni doubles down and doesn't let his coordinators push him around, because then again, that's another example to me of him not being cut out to be this head coach. If he kind of turtles to an older, demanding, powerful defensive coordinator that's running his side of the football, to me, that's a red flag. I don't want Vic Fangio's mentality to be what's running this team's summer program. I don't know. Again, I get Fangio where he's coming from, especially with a new team. You want to practice more. It's a much different looking roster, especially on Fangio's side of the ball on defense. It is young, and there are a lot of new pieces when it comes to starters and depth. So I would understand the logic to it a little bit, but I think they should just stay on course with how they practice. And the rest of the NFL, again, if you're concerned about rust, the rest of the NFL is going to be rusty too, because most teams adopt the same plan that the Eagles have in place right now for their training camp and preseason strategy. It's the same. So if the Eagles are going to be rusty, the rest of the league is too. So it kind of cancels itself out. And again, look at the last 2 years. And the Eagles, even in 2021, I don't think they were 2-5 because they were sluggish. I think it was, or ill-prepared. They just really weren't that talented, and Jalen Hurts was still a long ways away. And look at week 1. They came out flying against the Atlanta Falcons. They punched that team in the mouth. You look at the game against San Francisco. They weren't sluggish. Against Dallas, they just weren't as talented. They were a new team with a new developing quarterback. And, yeah, I hope Fangio... I'm a little bit nervous. I'm not going to lie. I really like Vic Fangio's philosophy on defense. I like to hear that the players are buying into his mentality, and I think he does get the most out of his players a lot. He's got a really good track record. It sounds great that he's trying to see what players do best and then form his scheme around that. That's what I've preached all the time. Put the best players on the field and then form your scheme around what they do best, rather than say, hey, players fit into my scheme, and if you don't fit, even if you're a more talented player than this guy, I'm going to throw him out there because he's a better scheme fit. That to me that's not what I want in a coach. So I was a little bit nervous about that with Fangio. It sounds like he's the opposite, which is a really good sign. But I am a little bit nervous about his older school mentality. I'm a little bit nervous about the report in Miami, some of the issues with star players in the secondary, this whole practice thing. He's just older school, and I'm not an old school guy when it comes to coaching. It sounds like the players are buying in, though, and it is a younger team, so I think it can fit right now. But I just wonder if Fangio's a John Tortorella, Tom Thibodeau type, where eventually he'll overstay his welcome when these younger defensive players become more established and they do become stars. Is Jalen Carter going to always love this guy? And that's the thing. I do wonder how he'll age with this team, because Fangio's not getting another head coaching job. So they probably want him here for the long term. So I'm curious about that. But I think Sirianni, I'm glad to hear in that press conference that it sounds like he's doubling down on his summer plan, because I think that's the right approach still this year. I don't think last year's collapse really has to do with they weren't working hard enough in practice. I really don't think that was a big part of it. And again, injuries was a huge part of it. And so you don't want to force these guys to play and to practice harder in the summer and potentially risk more injuries, because that's been what derails a lot of Eagles seasons, at least in my time hosting Locked On Eagles. All right, guys, coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast, it's time for Kicked Out of the Nest, a hot take I have that maybe most Eagles fans don't agree with. I'll get into it coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. Look, I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games in the sports. They're not sporting like we want them to, but FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I got to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everybody every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. Bet on some futures. Take Jalen Carter to win Defensive Player of the Year, Jalen Hurts for MVP, Chauncey Gardner-Johnson for comeback player, or maybe Saquon Barkley, maybe Saquon for offensive player. Head over to FanDuel.com and bet on it all. Plus, the Philadelphia Phillies are red hot right now. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball, so get your Phillies bets in as well. Once again, visit FanDuel.com. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, Eagles fans, we're wrapping up this Thursday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. It is time now for Thrown Out of the Nest, my every Thursday segment here to wrap up the show, where I give you a take that maybe most Eagles fans would not agree with. And I definitely think most don't agree with this one after seeing a lot of social media, X, TikTok. A lot of Eagles fans are talking about this and almost taking a little bit of a victory lap. It's been the Hard Knocks edition of the New York Giants offseason, and we're getting a lot of inside footage of GM Joe Schoen, John Mara, the owner, like a lot of the inside look at their negotiations with Saquon Barkley and the discussions they're having about their overall roster building philosophies. And a lot of Eagles fans, again, are taking a lap like, oh, look, John Mara, he hated the fact that the Eagles got Saquon Barkley. He said he's going to lose sleep over him going to a division rival, and how they're like, oh, Schoen's going to get fired just like A.J. Brown got the Tennessee Titans GM fired in a revenge game a couple years ago. Like, just kind of taking a lap, like, how stupid are the Giants to let this guy go? He was their best player. And again, I love the Saquon Barkley move for the Philadelphia Eagles, but I actually think that Mara being that upset that Saquon is gone makes me not like the move. It makes me like the move less, because it's his logic is like Saquon was their most important player, or I should say most popular player. Another Giants staff member said, like, what's our identity going to be if we lose our running back? And to me, I'm like, actually, I think Schoen's doing the right thing for them. Like, they're a rebuilding team trying to find out if their quarterback's the guy. Yeah, I wouldn't pay a running back $12+ million a year either when you're paying $40+ a year for Daniel Jones. Like, let him sink or swim this year and be the focal point of the offense. Schoen even said, like, we're not paying Daniel Jones $40 million to hand it off to a $12 million running back. I think he's crazy for believing in DJ still, but I do get the logic of, if you believe in Daniel Jones or you want to find out if he's the guy, that you just hand him the keys to the offense and you make him throw the football to Malik Neighbors instead of having Saquon run through it. So I actually get it for the Giants' perspective. I love it for the Eagles, and I understand it for the Giants. Like, I think it was honestly a win-win outcome, outside of course, the Giants having to play Saquon twice a year. But the owner, again, him like wanting a running back so bad, and the Eagles being the one that did what that owner, that I think is an idiot, he's the way he sounds, it makes me like it a little bit less. Like, oh man, like, we actually were the ones that paid the running back that's over 26 years old. Like, is this going to, nobody does it for a reason. We haven't done it for in a long time for a reason. Like, I don't know, is this going to blow back up? Like, the owner that really does not know football is really upset that Saquon's an Eagle. So I don't know. Again, I still like the move for the Eagles. I think it's going to work out, but I will say, like, everybody's taking this victory lap about like, oh, like their GM looks like a moron. Like Saquon, they let Saquon get away. And I'm like, I don't like, actually as badly as a lot of those Giants staff members wanted him back, makes me a little bit more weary of the move, because again, like, it's 2024. If you're that upset about a running back leaving, as good as Saquon Barkley is, like, you're still behind in the NFL. But again, it makes sense for the Eagles $13 million for a blue chip player like Saquon, if he does become an elite receiver, is not that much money. If he has the Christian McCaffrey type of impact, you're paying Saquon Darnell Mooney money for that kind of production, which is absolutely huge. He's going to be great, I think, behind a great offensive line and a better play caller to utilize him in many different ways. But yeah, like, this isn't a move that's guaranteed to work out. History tells us normally, if you pay a running back top money that's over the age of 26 that has an injury history like Saquon, that it doesn't really work out. And then the owner being upset that they didn't make that move, considering the Giants' life cycle right now, like where they're at in this, like their timeline of their rebuild, it makes me a little like, I don't know, everybody was taking a victory lap. I'm like, I think this makes us, not make us look bad, but I don't know. I think the GM actually is the right one. He's the one kind of getting dragged by not just Eagles fans, but by a lot of social media and by media members, where I'm like, the owner is actually the idiot. The guy that's talking about, like, what's our identity without a running back, that's the moron. Honestly, like, my one tweet blew up because I said watching that clip, like, I used to respect NFL staff members a lot, GMs, scouts, coaches, and I still do. But after getting the inside look of, like, this Giants coverage that we're getting, I've never had more confidence ever in my entire life than now that I could do those jobs. After hearing some of those guys talk, like, I think I could do it. I don't know. So that's just where I stand with that. I know that's probably an unpopular opinion. I'm not saying the Saquon Barkley move was stupid. I'm not saying it's going to blow up in their face. But the owner being that upset didn't make me feel more proud that the Eagles stole Saquon Barkley away. It's like, oh man, like, the dumb owner is the one that wanted what the Eagles did. So I don't know. That's just where I stand with it. All right, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow, and then we get ready for training camp next week. Thanks so much for making us your first listen each and every day. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening. And let's go, Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.